25 years after the first fleet landing, the white settlers crossed the Blue Mountains in 1813. This spelt the death knell for the traditional lifestyle of the Wiradjuri people west of the mountains. Through a series of misunderstandings combined with pure bloody-mindedness and greed on the part of some whites, a war broke out between the Wiradjuri and the white settlers supported by the soldiers. By 1824, the conflict had reached the point where the New South Wales government declared martial law, which gave the white soldiers and settlers licence to murder any Aboriginal person with impunity. The Wiradjuri resistance was led by a man called Windradine, who now has a Bathurst suburb named after him. The military might of the invaders was too strong for Windradine, also called Saturday by the whites. He took his extended family to Sydney and gave up the struggle. From that time, the Wiradjuri were forced off their traditional lands to settlements on the edges of white society.
"It's a buck! It's a buck!" And he gazed at the circle of men standing round, and back at the infant, a ball on the ground. "Yous got any gins nursing?" Apparently not, for the hammer went back on the Wesleyan Scot. And then there were cockatoos.
Well, have you heard the story of a leader on the western plain? The white man called him Saturday. To his people he was Windradine. To his people he was Windradine. Invaders crossed the mountain, drove the people off Wiradjuri land, bought diseases and poison blankets and bullets to kill Windradine. Bullets to kill Windradine. William Cox said, kill all the black men, wipe out the women and the young, manure the land with their bodies, point your weapons at Windradine, point your weapons at Windradine. Martial law, it was enacted in 1824. The soldiers and the white-skinned settlers became the murderers at Bell's Falls Gorge. Became the murderers at Bell's Falls Gorge. Windradine was defeated, died in Sydney with the children and the wives. But the people of the plains across the mountain won't forget brave Windradine. They won't forget brave Windradine. Well, now that you've listened to the story of the people on the western plain, pay some attention to the history of Wiradjuri and Windradine. the Wiradjuri and Windradine. The Wiradjuri and Windradine.
The Wiradjuri tribe. Harried we were and spent, broken and falling, ere as the cranes we went crying and calling. Summer shall see the bird backward returning, never shall there be heard those who went yearning. Emptied of us the land, ghostly our going, fallen like spears the hand dropped in the throwing. We are the lost who went, like the cranes crying, hunted, lonely and spent, broken and dying.
Written and oral records that tell of massacres and attitudes give a picture of the kind of society that was created and into which Jimmy Governor was born. Frontier pragmatism had no moral sense. It was driven by simplistic and brutal solutions to very complex problems. In 1824, at a public meeting, William Cox addressed the gathering.
The best thing that can be done is to shoot all the blacks and manure the ground with their carcasses. That is all the good they are fit for. It is also recommended that all the women and children be shot. That is the most certain way of getting rid of this pestilent race.
At Bells Falls Gorge near Wattle Flat, soldiers found a group of Aboriginal people camped around an escarpment above the falls. The soldiers circled around the camp, firing shots into the air. The Wiradjuri, fearful for their lives, fled into the bush. But all the time the soldiers advanced in a broad, deadly arc, pushing them closer and closer to the falls. Some of the men, realising what the soldiers were trying to do, attempted to break through the advancing military line. Some succeeded. Some were shot as they zigzagged through the undergrowth. Finally, the group was forced into a creek bed above the falls. Their lines of escape were cut off. The choice was simple. In front of them was the possibility of jumping to their deaths over the falls. Behind them were the soldiers, whose pincer movement was clamping them into a deadly vice. They had no option. Those who did not die from the gunfire grabbed their children and leapt. Their broken bodies piled up on the rocks below. Some 20 to 30 people had been wiped out.
No records were kept. If official explanations were sought, they were couched in suitably ambiguous terms. It was always the same. The white perspective was that they were more sinned against than sinning. Any Aboriginal people who were shot were clearly breaking the law. Martial law was used to justify every atrocity and every massacre. In the 17th of August 1900 edition of The Guardian, Richard Rouse reminisced.
The trouble between the stockman, who was murdered prior to my father's advent at Guntawang, was, as usual, over a gin. After the murder, the settlers made a raid on the tribes, and by firearms and poison succeeded in killing quite a number. Some years ago I met an old servant of Mr. Cox's in Sydney, where he told me that after the raid, bodies of the blacks were piled together and burnt, and he said, "Their black carcasses burned like old tar barrels." That was in 1824, the year before my father squatted at Guntawang. With reference to the newspaper yarns respecting the origin of Tommy Governor, father of Jimmy and Joe, they are all wrong. Tommy Governor was born on one of my father's stations on the Barwon. He came to Golgong district many years ago. Some time ago he came to me with a request that could I secure government rations for him. This was done. After a time he went to Wallar, where the rations were also served to him. When he came back to Golgong, the authorities refused his rations. This may have something to do with the breakout of his sons, Jimmy and Joe Governor. This was not the reason for the breakout of Jimmy Governor. It was the treatment he received from the landholders when he worked for them. He was hardly ever paid the correct payment for his work, no matter how good the quality was, and the treatment of his wife was the final straw.
There is much evidence to suggest Jimmy was aware of the massacres, the Aboriginal magic tradition and the lives of the famous bushrangers. Perhaps he felt adrift and alienated from his dreaming, caught between two worlds.
My name is Jimmy Governor. On the Talbragar I was born. I've roamed those lofty mountains from night till early morn. I've ranged those hills and valleys, me and my brother Joe, till he was shot and I was taken, which proved our overthrow. One night in our camp there commenced an awful row. Up went our cups and saucers, and I'll tell you how. We talked about bushranging. Underwood, Joe and me. We first went out and slaughtered old Morby's family.